Okay, as always, this is a short overview of the American Revolution. And as always, if you'd like to follow along, there is a link in the show notes to a note sheet. First, just let's talk about the two powers going into the war, Great Britain and the 13 colonies. Both had advantages and disadvantages. Great Britain was obviously much more populous than the United States would be, and that gave it a lot more individuals to draw from, and not only in terms of simply men to recruit into the army, but people to produce weapons and make other contributions to the war effort. The 13 colonies also had basically no navy whatsoever and would cede control of most of the coastal region of what would become the United States to the British throughout the war. The British also had very experienced soldiers who were used to fighting in European style combat. Every time that redcoats took on the colonial militias in a traditional European battlefield situation, the colonial militias came out the worse. But Great Britain didn't have all the advantages. First of all, the colonies could play defense. The 13 colonies were geographically large, they're massive compared to England. And Great Britain was going to struggle throughout the conflict to hold on to large swaths of territory. Great Britain also had a mix of good and bad commanders. They had some quality commanders, but they had others who had more or less just purchased their titles from the king, whereas the United States, by and large, experienced quality commanders throughout the war. Now, both sides had mixed support for the war, and I want to make that clear. There were loyalists in the colonies, but also back in Great Britain, there were many who were unwilling to pay the cost of trying to force the American colonists to stay within the British Empire. Moreover, Great Britain was going to have to fight this conflict on its own, whereas the colonies could reach out for aid from other European nations, and ultimately, as we know, the French would enter the war on the colonies' behalf. So, what I'm going to do is now give a quick overview of the major conflicts of the war and explain how each one of them contributed to the ultimate American victory. The American Revolution really begins at Lexington and Concord. At dawn on April 19th, some 700 British troops arrived in Lexington and came upon 77 militiamen gathered on the town green. A British major yelled, "Throw down your arms, ye villains, ye rebels!" But the heavily outnumbered militiamen had just been ordered by their commanders to disperse when a shot rang out. Now, to this day, this shot heard around the world. No one knows exactly who fired first. Several British volleys were subsequently fired before order could be restored. When the smoke cleared, 8 militiamen lay dead and 9 were wounded. Only one redcoat was injured. The British then continued on into Concord to search for arms, but not realizing the vast majority had already been relocated. They decided to burn what little they'd found, and the fire got a little out of control. Hundreds of militiamen occupying the high ground outside of Concord incorrectly thought that the entire town was going to be torched. So they hustled to Concord's North Bridge, which was being defended by a contingent of British soldiers. The British fired first, but fell back when the colonists returned the volley. So this was all the shot heard around the world, which would be later memorialized by poet Ralph Waldo Emerson. And Emerson actually wasn't the only artist to depict the battle, just so you know. But after searching Concord for about 4 hours, the British prepared to return to Boston, which was 18 miles away. Remember, this is 18 miles of marching over colonial roads. But by that time, almost 2,000 militiamen, known as Minutemen because of their ability to be ready on a moment's notice, had descended on the area and were constantly arriving. At first, the militiamen simply followed the British column. Fighting started soon afterwards, however, when the militiamen started firing at the British from behind trees, stone walls, houses, and sheds. Before long, the British were just throwing down their arms and trying to go into a full-out retreat. When the British column finally reached Lexington, it ran into an entire brigade of fresh redcoats who had answered the call for reinforcements. But that didn't stop the colonists firing again from behind trees and walls and anything they could get protection from, and resuming their attack all the way to Cambridge. The British, for their part, tried to keep the colonists at bay with flanking parties and even some cannon fire. And in the evening, a contingent of newly arrived Minutemen from Salem and Marblehead, Massachusetts, had a chance to cut off the Redcoats and maybe even finish off this contingent for good. But instead, the commander ordered them not to attack, and the British were able to save the safety of the Boston area, where they had significant naval support. But the main takeaway of the battles of Lexington and Concord was that it illustrated from the very beginning of the war that there were going to be two ways of fighting this war. There was going to be the British way, standard European combat, line up and fire en masse. And then there was going to be the American way, which is much more like backwoods Native American fighting, fire from behind trees and other areas of cover. Whenever the British had to fight that way, they were unsuccessful, just like the Americans were unsuccessful in countering British matched and pitched battles. Now, in November 1775, Lord Dunmore, the British governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation offering freedom to any enslaved persons of the rebellious Americans who could enter the British lines. Throughout the course of the war, tens of thousands of African Americans would seek their freedom by supporting the British. A much smaller number would fight on the side of the patriot pro-independence side. This, more than anything else, highlights the future conflict that's going to be in the new United States over whether or not the United States would be a free country or a country that still utilized enslaved labor. On June 16, 1775, on the heels of the battles of Lexington and Concord that kicked off the Revolutionary War, American troops learned that the British were planning to send troops from Boston to occupy the hills surrounding the city. If you go to Boston today, Bunker and Breeds Hill are both well within the city limits, but at the time they were on the outskirts. Some 100,000 colonial militiamen under Colonel William Prescott built earthen fortifications at the top of Breeds Hill, which is located on a peninsula overlooking Boston, again at the time. The men originally had been ordered to construct their fortifications atop Bunker Hill, but instead chose the smaller Breeds Hill, which was closer to Boston. On June 17th, some 2,200 British forces under the command of Major General William Howe landed on Charleston Peninsula and then just marched up to Breeds Hill. As the British Army advanced in columns against the Americans, Prescott, in an effort to conserve the Americans' very limited supply of ammunition, reportedly told his men the famous quote, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes," end quote. When the Redcoats were within several dozen yards, the Americans let loose with a lethal barrage of musket fire, throwing the British into retreat. After reforming their lines, the British attacked again and basically had the same result. But Prescott's men were now low on ammunition, and when the Redcoats went up the hill for a third time, they reached the redoubts, so those are dug-in fortifications, and engaged the Americans in hand-to-hand combat. The outnumbered and outgunned Americans were now forced to retreat. By the end of the engagement, the casualties of the Battle of Bunker Hill were high. Patriot gunfire had cut down around 1,000 enemy troops, with more than 200 killed and about 800 wounded. More than 100 Americans perished, while more than 300 were wounded. The Battle of Bunker Hill illustrates that the colonists were willing to pay the price, if they needed to defend territory. While the Battle of Bunker Hill was technically a tactical victory for the British at the end because they occupied Bunker Hill and Breeds Hill at the end, it was nonetheless somewhat of a Pyrrhic victory in that the British lost far more casualties than the Americans. In February of 1776, the first battle outside of New England took place, the Battle of Moores Creek. North Carolina's royal governor called for different regulars to arrive, and so British Colonel Donald McLeod began marching about 1,600 Loyalists from Cross Creek, North Carolina, toward the coast. And that was where they were supposed to rendezvous with other Loyalists and Redcoats at Brunswick, which is in North Carolina. This is exactly when a Patriot commander arrived at Moores Creek Bridge, which is near present-day Wilmington, just ahead of the British Loyalists. He positioned his troops in the woods on either side of the bridge, awaiting the British with cannons and muskets at the ready. The British learned of the Patriot troops at Moores Creek in advance, but expecting only a small force, decided to advance across the bridge to attack. The British Loyalists advanced, shouting, "King George and broadswords," and moved across the bridge. But they were absolutely massacred by a barrage of Patriot musket and cannon fire from their concealed positions on the woods on the other side of the bridge. The British Loyalists quickly surrendered, giving the Patriots a victory and an important morale boost. The victory also critically, and here's the major outcome, aborted British plans to occupy Brunswick and effectively ended British authority in North Carolina for almost the entire rest of the war. Further to the south, in South Carolina, on June 28, 1776, the siege of South Carolina, which was a short but important military episode in the early years of the American Revolution, came to an end. A small Patriot force defending Charleston under the overall command of Major General Charles Lee, he's future father, in fact, of Robert E. Lee, successfully repelled a combined British assault of about almost 3,000 soldiers. This is on June 28, 1776. The Americans used a fortification on Sullivan's Island successfully, as the fort dominated the narrow channel into Charleston Harbor and prevented, crucially, any British ships from entering. The Patriot victory is important because it ultimately increased the sentiment for independence among South Carolina's population. And in fact, the British did not return to the southern colonies in force for nearly 3 years as a result of the failed siege of Charleston. This also gave the colonies the impetus to, in March of 1776, start a revolutionary convention. In fact, in March of that year, North Carolina was the first to vote in favor of independence. 7 other colonies followed suit by mid-May, and on June the 7th, the Virginia delegate Richard Henry Lee introduced a motion calling for the colony's independence before the Continental Congress when it met in Philadelphia. The Continental Congress did convene on July the 1st, and the following day, 12 of the 13 colonies adopted Lee's resolution for independence. The process of considering and revising Jefferson's declaration, including John Adams and Benjamin Franklin's corrections, continued on July the 3rd and late into the morning of July 4th, during which Congress deleted and revised about a fifth of the text. The delegates made no changes to the key preamble, however, and the basic Declaration of Independence would remain Jefferson's words. Congress officially adopted the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July, though most historians do agree now that the document wasn't actually signed until August the 2nd. The Declaration of Independence was a crucial turning point in the history of democracy in the United States. In addition to its importance in the fate of the American nation, it also exerted a tremendous influence outside the United States, most memorable in France during the French Revolution. Together with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence can be counted as one of the 3 essential founding documents of the United States. While the signing of the Declaration of Independence was a major step forward for the American colonies, George Washington was in need of a victory. After being booted from New York, the American commander and army was reeling. He sought to regain the momentum in Christmas 1776, when Washington and 5,400 American colonial troops crossed the Delaware River, hoping to surprise a Hessian force celebrating Christmas at their winter quarters in Trenton, New Jersey. Hessians, by the way, were German mercenary forces paid to serve in the Americas during the Revolution. The unconventional attack came after several months of substantial defeats for Washington's army that had resulted, as I said, in the loss of New York City and other strategic points in the region. At about 11 p.m. on Christmas, Washington's army commenced its crossing of the half-frozen river at 3 locations. 2,400 soldiers, led personally by Washington, successfully braved the icy and freezing river and reached the New Jersey side of the Delaware just before dawn. The other 2 divisions, made up of some 3,000 men and, crucially, the artillery, failed to reach the meeting point. At 8 a.m. on the morning of December the 26th, Washington's remaining force descended on the unsuspecting Hessians. Trenton's 1,400 Hessian defenders were groggy and underestimated the Patriot threat after months of decisive British victories throughout New York. Washington's men quickly overwhelmed the Germans' defenses, and by 9:30 in the morning, the town was surrounded. Although several hundred Hessians escaped, nearly 1,000 were captured at the cost of only four American lives. Unfortunately, because Washington's army had failed to cross the Delaware, most of it that is, he was without adequate artillery or men and was forced to withdraw from the town. While the victory was not particularly significant from a tactical standpoint, news of Washington's initiative raised the spirits of the American colonists, who previously feared that his army was incapable of victory. This was therefore an important morale victory for the American colonists, and which was followed up by probably the most important tactical victory of the Revolution, the Battle of Saratoga. There's actually two battles of Saratoga, Bemis Heights and Freeman's Farm, both in early fall 1777. After a failed Canadian invasion known as the Battle of Quebec, which had left much of the Continental Army beaten and sick in retreat, the British hoped to finally destroy the rebellion in New England by isolating it from the other American colonies. They also hoped to discourage potential American allies, such as France, from joining the fight. To accomplish this, the British decided that they would take upstate New York and control the Hudson River, thereby isolating New England. In the spring of 1777, the British ordered 3 of their armies to merge in Albany, New York. Only one army, however, commanded by General John Burgoyne, made the final push to its destination. Waiting for them was the heavily fortified Northern Department of the Continental Army, commanded by the intrepid General Horatio Gates. The opposing armies came to face one another on September the 19th at the Battle of Freeman's Farm, located on the map just below Lake George. This was the abandoned farm of a Loyalist near Saratoga, New York. The fierce fighting lasted for several hours. The momentum changed sides several times, but neither side gained significant ground until Burgoyne ordered his column of German troops to support the faltering British line and forced the Americans to pull back. Still, it was another Pyrrhic victory, as the British suffered around twice the number of casualties as the Americans and were unable to complete the drive to Albany. General Burgoyne, as an aside, is a much maligned figure from the British perspective throughout the American Revolution. Titled Gentleman Johnny in most of the sources, he insisted on traveling not only with his wife, but also their fine china and several pieces of art, which were toted along as they made the long march from St. John's near Montreal all the way south. This slowed the British progress and made it much easier for the Americans to spring the ultimate trap. Can't blame Burgoyne completely for the misstep, however, as the British had absolutely no sense of the distance from Montreal to Albany and badly miscalculated. After the Battle of Freeman's Farm, Burgoyne decided to stay put and wait for reinforcements from New York City. In the meantime, more and more American troops began to pour in, and Horatio Gates's army expanded to nearly 13,000 colonial troops. By October the 7th, with his supplies dwindling, Burgoyne realized that waiting for backup to come from New York was in vain. He sent out a reconnaissance force to attack the Americans' left flank in a wooded area of Bemis Heights, south of Saratoga. However, the Americans got wind of the movement and forced the British to withdraw. Burgoyne decided to cut his losses and take his army north to safety, but heavy rain and frigid temperatures slowed their retreat. Within 2 days, Gates's soldiers surrounded what remained of Burgoyne's army. Out of supplies and out of options, Burgoyne officially surrendered his army to Gates on October the 17th, 1777. The battle became known as the Battle of Bemis Heights, or the Second Battle of Saratoga, and would prove to be the turning point in the war and the battle that most historians believe convinced France to enter the conflict on the side of the Americans. While all this was going on, George Washington and his troops were suffering through the long winter at Valley Forge, located about 20 miles northwest of Philadelphia. The men were hungry and tired after a string of losing battles that had resulted in the British capture of the Patriot capital of Philadelphia earlier that fall at the Battle of Brandywine. The string of humiliating defeats had led some members of the Continental Congress to actually replace George Washington, believing that he was incompetent. The Valley Forge winter site for the army was about a day's march from the British-held Philadelphia. Washington picked the spot because it was close enough to keep an eye on the British troops sheltering in Philadelphia, yet far enough away to prevent a surprise attack on his own Continental Army. Washington and his men would remain there for about 6 months, from December 1777 till June 1778. All of these areas had to be built from whole cloth, and soldiers constructed about 1,500 to 2,000 log huts to house themselves. Unfortunately, times were bad in Valley Forge. Popular images of life depict tremendous suffering from cold and starvation. Unfortunately, while it was cold, the National Park Service says there really wasn't anything out of the ordinary at the conditions of Valley Forge, characterizing the hardship as quote-unquote suffering as usual. Really, if anything, it wasn't the conditions themselves, it was the lack of organization. Food, money shortages plagued the Continental Army throughout the first half of the 7-year-long revolution. And these problems were simply exacerbated in the conditions around Valley Forge. While the winter of 1777-78 really wasn't particularly cold, many soldiers just lacked proper clothing, which left them unfit to serve. Many were shoeless. As Washington described in a December 1777 letter, quote, "We have by field returned this day no less than almost 3,000 men now in camp unfit for duty because they are barefoot and otherwise naked," end quote. Rations were low, disease set in. The most common illnesses included influenza, typhus, typhoid, fever, dysentery, conditions that were almost certainly exacerbated by the poor hygiene and sanitation at the camp. Despite these harsh conditions, Valley Forge is sometimes called the birthplace of the American Army, because by June of 1778, the weary troops emerged with a rejuvenated spirit and confidence and had become a well-trained fighting force. But how could that possibly be? Well, much of the credit doesn't go to Washington. Much of the credit goes to a late arrival in the American camp, Prussian military officer Friedrich Wilhelm Baron von Steuben. At the time, the Prussian army was widely regarded as one of the best in Europe, and von Steuben had a very sharp military mind. He arrived in Valley Forge on February the 23rd, 1778. George Washington, impressed by his abilities, soon appointed von Steuben temporary inspector general. In his role, von Steuben set standards for the camp layout, sanitation, and conduct. Importantly, he demanded that the latrines be placed facing downhill on the opposite side of camp as the kitchens, which is kind of obvious, but apparently wasn't obvious to anyone else at the time. Soon, he became the Continental Army's drill master. Von Steuben, who spoke very little English, ran the troops through a gamut of intense Prussian-style drills. He taught them to efficiently load, fire, and reload weapons, charge with bayonets, and march in compact lines of 4 instead of mile-long single-file marches. Von Steuben helped to prepare a manual called Regulations for Order and Discipline of the Troops of the United States, which was also called the Blue Book and what remained the official training manual of the Army for decades. In 1776, France was one of the greatest powers in Europe. Still reeling from its losses of the American colonies at the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, the country remained a global power with a strong army and navy. Like Great Britain, France also had a young king. In 1776, Louis XVI was just 22 years old and had only been king for 2 years. His reign, unfortunately, was going to end with the French Revolution and his head in the basket, although he didn't know that at this time. Louis and the rest of his cabinet was always looking for an opportunity to poke Great Britain, their great rival, in the eye. From the outset of the Revolutionary War, French intellectuals followed events in America, and many were hoping that France would join the war, especially Benjamin Franklin, who arrived in Paris in December 1776 as the first official representative of the United States in France. Franklin and others worked to secure secret shipments of French weapons, equipment, and uniform. Finally, in 1778, following the Battle of Saratoga, the relationship between France and the United States was formalized with the Treaty of Alliance, and the Kingdom of France officially entered the war. Years previously, the Marquis de Lafayette, one of the most famous non-Americans to fight in the Revolution, had already joined up with General Washington. Today, the space across from the White House is known as Lafayette Square in his honor. But it wasn't a straightforward American victory from there. In April of 1780, the British redoubled their efforts on retaking the southern colonies, which they saw as weaker and more likely to flip to their side given the higher percentage of Loyalists, particularly compared to New England, and were easily able, in April of 1780, to take the city of Charleston, which they had failed to take several years earlier. For the first 3 years of the American Revolutionary War, most of the battles took place in the northern colonies. But after especially the French entered the war on the side of the Americans in 1778, as I mentioned, the British shifted their focus to a campaign in the South. From the South, the British monarchy believed that they could more readily capture the areas in the North. And the campaign was initially successful as the British seized, as I said, key ports of Savannah, Charleston, and so forth and so on. The tide, however, finally began to turn back in the American favor in the fall of 1780. And that was when a Patriot militia defeated a Loyalist militia, there's a lot of militia fighting, at the Battle of Kings Mountain in present-day South Carolina. In late 1780, General George Washington appointed Major General Nathaniel Greene to head a Continental Army in the South. The new commander decided to divide his troops in the Carolinas in order to force the larger British contingent, under Lieutenant General George Cornwallis, to fight them on multiple fronts. The strategy paid off, and in January 1781, Brigadier General Daniel Morgan decisively defeated a British force commanded by Colonel Tarleton at Cowpens, South Carolina. Following Cowpens, Cornwallis pursued the Continentals across North Carolina before halting his tired troops at the Dan River. The Continentals escaped into Virginia, where Greene continued to build up his forces in preparation to face off against Cornwallis's troops. By March the 14th, Greene soldiers had returned to North Carolina and were camped around Guilford Courthouse, near present-day Greensboro. The Battle of Guilford Courthouse took place on March 15, 1781. Around 1,900 British soldiers under Cornwallis went on the offensive against Greene's 4,500 Continental troops and militia. The battle raged for about 2 hours before Greene ordered his troops to retreat, which again gave the British a tactical victory, but enabled Greene's army to retreat mostly intact. One British statesman said, quote, "Another such victory would ruin the British army, as nearly 25% of Cornwallis's men had been killed, wounded, or captured in the effort." This meant as a result that Cornwallis was completely unable to pursue Greene's army, resulting in yet another Pyrrhic victory for the British forces. Nathaniel Greene continued his efforts in May of 1781, when the 96th, the longest siege of the American Revolution, took place in the South Carolina backcountry. 96 was actually on the Saluda River, critical for the defense of the northwest portion of the state, and was probably the most strategically important position in South Carolina. It was manned by 550 Loyalists. The Patriots laid siege to the city beginning on May the 22nd, 1781. And this siege would continue all the way until June 19th. It would be a failure, unfortunately, for Colonel Major General Nathaniel Greene, because as additional Loyalists arrived, he was forced to withdraw. Still, the Americans were searching for their last and final victory to seal the deal. The Battle of Yorktown would give them exactly what they needed. With the Continental Army positioned in New York, Washington and the French Navy General, Rochambeau, teamed to plan a timed attack with the arrival of more French forces. When they found out that the French fleet was instead sailing to Chesapeake Bay, Washington concocted a plan. He decided that he would fool the British general into thinking that the Continentals were planning to attack New York City. Instead, what he was actually going to do was sneak away south and attack General Cornwallis, who had come up from the Carolinas into Virginia. By mid-September 1781, Washington and his French counterparts arrived in Williamsburg, Virginia, 13 miles from the tobacco port of Yorktown, where Cornwallis's men had built a defense of 10 small forts, which were called redoubts, with artillery batteries and connecting trenches. In response, Cornwallis sent word up to Clinton in New York for aid. Clinton promised him a fleet of 5,000 British soldiers and set sail to Yorktown. Unfortunately for Cornwallis, those troops were never going to make it. With a small force left in New York, about 2,500 Americans and 4,000 French soldiers, facing some 8,000 British troops, they began digging their own trenches about 800 yards and started a week-long artillery assault on the enemy in Yorktown, starting around October the 9th. Quote, "The heavy cannons pounded the British mercilessly, and by October 11th had knocked out most of the British guns." This is according to the Heritage Center Foundation. Cornwallis received the unfortunate news that Clinton's departure from New York had been delayed. It would be delayed indefinitely. Slowly but surely, the Americans dug parallel trenches closer and closer to the British line. Washington ordered further attacks that would take place on October 11th. And in fact, the attack on Redoubt number 9 and number 10 would be led by none other than Colonel Alexander Hamilton, who years later would recall that many, many, many times to anyone who would listen to him. On the nightfall of October the 14th, the Allies fired several consecutive shells in the air, and at that point, Hamilton and his men rallied from their trenches and sprinted across the open field with bayonets fixed. They fell upon their enemies, and according to quotations, the whole operation had been consumed in less than 10 minutes. Of his 400 infantrymen, Hamilton lost just 9 in the attack. Cornwallis was officially trapped. The next day, the French fleet arrived, pinning Cornwallis down. On the morning of October the 19th, the British sent forward a red-coated drummer boy, followed by an officer, waving a white handkerchief. As guns fell silent, everything became clear. Cornwallis had surrendered. Following the Battle of Yorktown and Cornwallis's surrender, the British, down 1/3 of its total force, were forced to face the inevitable conclusion. The British Parliament, in March of 1782, passed a resolution calling for the nation to end the war. The British still had 30,000 men in North Carolina, occupying the seaports of New York, Charlestown, and Savannah. But the demoralizing loss at Yorktown simply crushed the British will to continue to fight the rebels. As a result of all this, by the way, there were a number of loyalists in the different parts of what would become the United States who had a really difficult choice to make. They could stay, but they had just thrown in with King George. And the fact that the war was coming to an end did not particularly bode well for their final conclusions. Many of these people did choose to remain in the United States and found a place in the new American government. Others went to Canada. Some went to the Caribbean, and others still went back to Great Britain. By 1783, the Treaty of Paris was formalized, and the United States of America had gained its independence. There were still some thorny issues that needed to be worked out. For example, the British occupied several border forts in what was referred to as the Northwest Territory, which is really modern day states like Ohio and Michigan and so forth. They wouldn't cede those forts, and that issue would continue to present itself all the way through the War of 1812. Moreover, the British did receive a concession from the Americans that all debts taken out during the war would be repaid in British sterling, a factor of significant importance to the Brits. Ultimately, the United States was able to triumph in the Revolutionary War because of its will to no longer be a part of Great Britain. It turned its advantages, such as land and strong quality commanders, into the ultimate turning points of the war. It got lucky along the way and very fortunate that France, only adding to its bankruptcy issues by joining the war, was willing to support the American colonists. It's an interesting what if, what might have happened had the British been successful in isolating New England and ending the war in 1777. But that isn't what happened. And the American story begins.